Okay. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Winning Words Initiative. I hope you're all feeling very philosophical this morning. The Winning Words Initiative is a conference devoted to the what, why, and how questions that arise when thinking about philosophizing with young people and children. If we succeed here today, we will make some progress in understanding what philosophy is, both in general and specifically for young people, why it should be part of the K-12 educational process, and how to make it part of that process in concrete terms. So we'll start out on a more theoretical side, and then by the afternoon we'll be heavily invested in practice. I'm Bart Schultz, the director of the University of Chicago Civic Knowledge Project, the Community Connection side of the Humanities Division, and I'll be doing a lot of the hosting and introducing today. The Civic Knowledge Project, or CKP, shares the views expressed by our old friend, National Humanities Medalist Earl Shorus, the founder of the Clemente course in the Humanities, who regarded the humanities, especially philosophy, as not only vital to the good life and crucial to a decent education, but also as an effective tool for helping people get out of poverty and stay out of poverty. You've been robbed, he would say, to the many students, both young and old, who came to him for help because they had never been given the opportunity to share the joys of the humanities. That's how many of us here today feel about those children and young people who've never been encouraged, given the opportunities to philosophize. They've been robbed, and they're being robbed every day, of something much more valuable than the latest cell phone. And fortunately, we can do something about that. Parents, teachers, administrators, college and university students, and the younger students themselves really have the power to bring more philosophy to their lives. And today we have a marvelous group of people assembled here to demonstrate that, both the ones who will be up here on the stage and so many of you in the audience. You'll all need to participate. You all need to be engaged, asking the necessary questions. After all, where would philosophy be without questions? I expect we'll have people trickling in throughout the day, and I'm delighted that we have so many distinguished institutions, schools, community organizations, museums represented here, so many wonderful students who really do mean it. You have to actively participate in today's procedures. You have a lot to add to this program, so please do take that seriously. So we have a lot to do, and we'd better get on with it. I'm delighted that our very first guest here to welcome you on behalf of the University of Chicago is old friend Sonia Malunda, Senior Associate Vice President in our Office of Civic Engagement. Please give her a hand.
Good morning. Okay, great. Good morning. All right, that's much better. Thank you. Thank you, Bart, for that introduction, and I'm so delighted to be with you this morning on behalf of the university and the Office of Civic Engagement. I must say that our collaboration with Bart and his team and the Civic Knowledge Project has just been wonderful. And civic engagement at our university extends beyond one office or a few people. It's really programs such as the Winning Words Initiative, the work that our students are doing in the community, our faculty and others that really make us a more outwardly and civically engaged university. I'd also like to thank each of you for being here today. It's my understanding that some of you traveled from faraway places to be with us, and even if you traveled from across the city, we really appreciate you all being here on a Saturday morning. And clearly your presence this morning demonstrates the commitment that you have to improving the quality of K through 12 education locally and nationally. What I'd like to do is just say a few words about the university and its role as an anchor institution in the city, and spend most of my time very briefly talking about the university's role as an educator, because that directly ties into your program today. So a few facts about the university as an anchor. We have about 15,000 students, and roughly 15,000 employees. The university is the second largest private employer in the city of Chicago, and by far the largest employer on the South Side. Most of our activity in terms of working, studying, students living, it all occurs in this Hyde Park area. We have gotten more actively engaged in almost every aspect of quality of life over the last 20 or 30 years. And for those of you who are new to Chicago, if you have a chance, visit Hyde Park. 53rd Street is where you will see a major transformation of the commercial and retail corridor there. And that's work that the university has been doing in concert with the public and the private sector, as well as with the community. Our role as an educator, you may not be aware that we're a very unique research university in that we run the private independent laboratory schools, and then in addition to that, we run 4 campuses of our charter schools. So we have a combined 4,000 students from nursery through 12th grade in our pre-collegiate schools. And we also are very active through what's called the Urban Education Institute, where we take the research of urban education and we really marry that with the practice of running schools and training teachers. Beyond the laboratory schools and the Urban Education Institute, we've also made a significant commitment to K through 12 education in our city. For example, we have hundreds of college students working in our neighborhood schools as teaching assistants and tutors. Matter of fact, they're working in about 30 neighborhood schools across the Mid-South Side. And we believe this work not only helps the schools and the educators and teachers in those schools, but it also gives our students a unique college experience outside of the classroom. We consider that to be reciprocal engagement. So when we're outwardly engaged as a university, we're not only helping and benefiting the schools and others, but we're gaining much more as a university when we're able to provide those out-of-school classroom opportunities for our students. We not only send our students out, but we've opened our campus up more to middle and high school students from across the city for cultural events, lectures, classes, and college readiness. And you will see in the back of the room, and I'll just share it with you, we announced last year a new initiative, UChicago Promise. And this is the university's commitment to helping young people who live in the city of Chicago to help them attain college. And not only college here at our university, but to share with them the additional information that they need to know to prepare for college. And so, for example, for those students who apply to the University of Chicago and are accepted, if they're from the city of Chicago and they have a financial aid need, we can guarantee to them a debt-free education while they're studying here at the University of Chicago. In addition to that, for those students who are looking at colleges and universities from across the country, we have what we call an admissions academy, where we're hosting essay writing, and I see some young people are here from our local high schools. We're hosting essay writing workshops, financial aid workshops, so that we can share with our young people from our city the information we've gained over the years in the admissions area. All of this work is designed to make college more accessible and affordable to our neighbors here in the city. And then in addition to that, we run a whole list of college readiness programs. The campus in particular during the summer months just buzzes with activity because we have high school students here on campus taking courses, faculty working with them in their labs, and preparing them for the college experience. And none of this work would really be possible without our collaborations and partnerships both on the campus and throughout the community and the city. And so once again, I'd just like to thank Bart for his work with the Winning Words Initiative. When we have lunch periodically, we usually come out of that lunch with at least 3 or 4 ideas that we can run with. And we, as a university, appreciate what you're doing today and look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you very much.
I want to get on to our first speaker here, the distinguished Delta Kappa Epsilon Professor CDC Reeve. CDC Reeve works primarily in ancient Greek philosophy, especially Plato and Aristotle, and he has published an extraordinary number of works in this area. His books include Philosopher Kings, Socrates in the Apology, Practices of Reason, Substantial Knowledge, Love's Confusions, Action, Contemplation, and Happiness, an essay on Aristotle, Blindness and Reorientation, Problems in Plato's Republic, and Aristotle on Practical Wisdom. He's translated the works of Plato and Aristotle. I don't think I've ever had the pleasure of introducing a speaker that I just know has been read by so many undergraduates. We use his translations here at the University of Chicago all the time, and in fact, people use them across the country. He's an extraordinarily distinguished scholar, and I'm so glad he was able to come here to help us today to start thinking about what a Socratic education really means. The title of his talk, he'll explain it to you, actually. It's called Emergency Socrates Talk, and I think Socrates is a bit of an emergency, but this is a good time to bring him up here to explain the meaning of that. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Bart, for inviting me and for that. Can you hear, everyone hear me all right? Yes? For that nice welcome and for reading out the long list of books that I've written. The writerly life is an extremely pleasant one. And I think that it's something to remember that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates too recommend the philosophical life as the best one. And sometimes I think even my colleagues, when they hear this, they hear it with a kind of grain of salt. You know, I think, oh yeah, well, maybe it is. But actually I think Plato and Aristotle and Socrates are close to being right about that the philosophical life is the best one. And I don't think they mean the life of professional philosophers necessarily. I think that to some degree what they have in mind is what Socrates says, when maybe the most famous thing that he said, which is that the unexamined life is not a life for a human being. And I want to try to explain that a little bit, but at the same time I want to present Socrates in a light in which I think he's not often presented. My experience in teaching Socrates is that students don't like him very much, and it may be that many of you don't like him either. That, you know, he's aggressive, it seems. He's always asking niggly little questions about things, and he's always claiming to refute people, and it can seem a little irritating. And I want to try to present that questioning in a context that makes it seem more than that. Now, let me talk about the title, Emergency Socrates Talk. Well, I got it from the subject line in Bart's invitational email, because you really should be hearing Arnold Davidson talk to you today, but Arnold is sick and I hope he soon recovers. And so Bart reached out to me in an emergency, would you please? So I thought, my goodness, an emergency Socrates talk. It's a great idea. And actually what it made me do was reflect on the fact that so many of Socrates' talks are emergency talks. So when we first meet Socrates, for example, It's when he runs into Euthyphro in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. Socrates is on his way to the King Archon's court in Athens to hear what the capital charges are that have been brought against him, charges that will eventually lead to his death. That I take it as an emergency, a matter of life and death, a serious one. In fact, it's a double emergency because Euthyphro is attending the King Archon's court because he's prosecuting his father on a capital charge. So we've got two life or death issues brought together. And then, of course, the next time we meet Socrates, it's when he's on trial for his life. It's in Plato's Apology. He's now facing a jury of 501 Athenians, and he has been put on trial for not believing in the gods in whom the city believes, but in other strange, daimonic, spiritual doings or goings-on, and of corrupting the youth by teaching them these things. And in fact, I suppose if I had more time, I'd want to elaborate on this notion of philosophy as a corrupter of youth, because it does seem to me that there's a way in which philosophy ought to embrace this and ought to say, yes, it does corrupt the youth. That is, from a certain point of view, because what it does is it makes them think about values that they've been encouraged to accept without thinking about them. And in the course of thinking about them, they do get some of them challenged, and that from the point of view of unchallengeable values can seem like corruption. The next time we meet Socrates, it's in the Crito, where he's now in prison awaiting execution, and Crito, his friend, comes and says, "Why don't you run away?" And again, it's a matter of life and death. Now, in the Apology, what we see is, and indeed in all these dialogues, is we see that Socrates would rather sacrifice his biological life, the one the hemlock will put an end to, than his philosophical life, his authentic life, as I want to call it. And I'm going to use these two notions of biological life and authentic life to try to cast Socrates in a new light. In the Apology, he says extraordinary things that ought to make us wonder whether he's sane. He says of Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, the three people who are prosecuting him, he says that they won't harm me by having me executed. They'll harm themselves more. By putting an innocent man on trial for his life, they're harming themselves more than I would be harmed if I were put to death. And then he says, just in case you didn't get it, he says boldly, a good man is not harmed in this life or in the next. Now, you think, but good people are harmed all the time. What could he mean? The implication, notice, is that the me that won't be harmed by execution, the authentic one, as I'm calling it, is the good me. As a good man is not harmed. I, as a good man, am not harmed. What is the good man? And I think to understand it, you have to think of two other famous Socratic sayings or claims. The one I mentioned before, the life of a human being is not worth living. Hode anexetastos bios ubiotos anthropo. The life of a human, it's not the life of a human being, the unexamined life. And the other is the famous one he takes from the temple of Apollo in Delphi, which everybody knows, no theise auton, know thyself. And those are the two that I want to use to make this little transition. What is it to have an authentic life? It's to live in a way that you genuinely believe to be worth living. It's to live in accord with values that you think are genuine values. It's to have your life, as it were, express what you think to be really valuable, so that, as it were, you want to live it because you think it's a valuable life. You think that you could defend living it because it's a valuable and worthwhile life. So it has all those kinds of features. It's yours in that strong sense. Let's listen to Socrates speak for a minute from the Apology. You'll probably remember this famous passage. Suppose, he says to the jury, you were to say to me, Socrates, we will not obey Anytus and the prosecutors this time. Instead, we're prepared to let you go, but on the following condition, that you spend no more time on this investigation of yours and don't practice philosophy. And if you're caught doing so, you'll die. Well, as I just said, if you were to let me go on these terms, I'd reply to you, I have the utmost respect and affection for you, men of Athens, but I'll obey the god rather than you, and as long as I draw breath and I am able, I won't give up practicing philosophy, exhorting you, and also showing you the way to any of you that I happen to meet, saying just the sorts of things I'm accustomed to say. And now he quotes himself. My excellent man, you're an Athenian. You belong to the greatest city, renowned for its wisdom and strength. Are you not ashamed that you take care to acquire as much wealth as possible, and reputation and honor, but that about wisdom and truth, about how your soul may be in the best possible condition, you take neither care nor thought? Then if one of you disagrees and says that he does care, I won't let him go away immediately, but I'll question, examine, and test him. And if he doesn't seem to me to possess virtue, though he claims he does, I'll reproach him, saying that he treats the most important things as having the least value and the inferior ones as having the most. Having authentic values, we see, involves being able to defend them cogently when talking to Socrates. If you can't defend them, if you can't defend the way you live, you don't have an authentic life, a life of your own. You're biologically alive, you're ticking over, but you're humanly, personally dead. A second point, maybe part of the same one, the paramount values that you have to have an authentic life are moral values. Let's hear Socrates again. You see, I do nothing else except go around trying to persuade you, both young and old alike, not to care about your bodies or your money as intensely as about your soul and how it may be in the best possible condition. I say it's not from wealth that virtue comes, but from virtue comes money and all the other things that are good for human beings, both in private and public life. Now, if in saying this, I'm corrupting the youth, this is what you'd have to think to be harmful. But if anyone claims I say something other than this, he's talking nonsense. The idea is this: if you're to value things correctly, you must be a reliable measure of them. You must, when you measure, which is better? What should I do? Which is right? When you do that, if you're going to do it correctly, you have to be a reliable measuring instrument of those things. You have to register their values correctly. But you won't be that if you are, for example, unjust or intemperate or cowardly. Instead, to take the case of courage, you'll rate minor dangers as major ones, as ones to be avoided at all costs. So if you're not courageous, a courageous person is someone who sees real dangers as real dangers and avoids them when necessary. A coward is somebody who thinks that minor dangers are huge dangers and kind of runs away. It's the cowards, and the virtues now are to be thought of not as so much features of the will as features of the intellect. How are you registering the facts of reality? If you're a coward, you don't register them correctly. And in the case of justice, you'll overvalue your interests by comparison with someone else's. You'll think, for example, that it's better that you have his $500 than that he have it. When Socrates tells us that money comes from virtue, if that's what he tells us, the Greek is a bit messed up and people have tried. I think what he's trying to express is this. you won't properly register the value of money if you aren't virtuous. You'll think it's more valuable than it is. And that's a different way that's usually said, that if you don't have the virtues, you won't use it correctly. But I think the reason you don't use it correctly is that you misrepresent its value. You think it's much more valuable than it actually is. Hemlock attacks biological life. It causes us to lose our biological life, maybe in convulsions. And actually, there's a very nice story. I don't know if you know it. It's true, but it's a great story about the hemlock. Everyone has seen David's great painting, The Death of Socrates, where Socrates is sitting with his hand pointing up, and all his followers are moping and weeping and so forth, and he's sitting calmly pointing upwards as the hemlock kills them. And Roman Stoics emulated the death of the philosopher calm in the face of death. And it was a famous article, I think, published in the 1960s or somewhere like that. Now, somebody actually went out and asked, what happens if you take hemlock? No one had ever bothered to ask this question. But eventually somebody thought, maybe we should do an experiment and see, how do you die from hemlock? And he discovered that hemlock was a convulsive poison, that it causes massive intestinal convulsions. And there's just no way, no matter how stoical you are, that you couldn't avoid being convulsed by it. So then he said, so this portrayal of Socrates calmly dying is Plato's invention. And all those Stoics were emulating a representation, not the real thing at all, but a picture. And so it went on until sometime, I think in the 2000s, when a young woman at Cornell, who happened to be two things, a classicist and a botanist. Think of the rare. That's probably a pretty rare combination. But anyway, she said, but there are lots of different hemlock plants. Which ones did the Athenians use in their hemlock? And as it turned out that one produces convulsions, but the other doesn't. And in fact, so now it was opened up again. Maybe Plato was correctly representing. That's just a little story. It shows how often facts are crucially important to understanding even ancient texts. In any case, hemlock attacks biological life. It kills an animal. You can kill a rat with hemlock as well as with a man. But it doesn't in the same way threaten autonomous life. Life that can only be lost, really, through betraying one's values. You lose autonomous life, or authentic life, rather, by ceasing to be authentic, by betraying what you take to be the deepest values. It's this that makes sense of the Gospel of Matthew, I think, 16:25, something that a great classicist said was the deepest thing ever said in ethics. I don't know whether that's right, but it's clearly something deep anyway. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life shall find it. Now, how are we to make sense of that? Well, I'm offering you a way to think about it, the difference between the biological life and the authentic life. If you lose your biological life for the sake of your authentic life, there's a way in which you have not lost the life that is yours, the authentic one, right? Even though but if you sacrifice your authentic life, or your biological life, if Socrates had said, okay, I'll stop philosophizing. You've threatened me with death. I don't want to die. I'll give it up. Then he would have traded the life of philosophy, the authentic life, for his biological life. Once we distinguish biological life and autonomous life, in any case, and see the role of Socratic conversation in authentic life, we see that all of Socrates' talks are actually emergency Socrates talks. They're always about matters of authentic life and death. So, because they're always about this, right? They're always, you think justice, friendship, temperance, wisdom, you think those are really important things. I see. So you think that your life ought to be built around those. But when I question you about them, you don't know anything about them. These are your deepest values, but you don't understand very much about them at all. And that's the challenge. It isn't this, that Socrates is just smart, good at questions and answers, a kind of bamboozler of the lesser endowed when it comes to playing smart games with words. That's the Socrates that I think alienates. The Socrates that invites, right, that we can see as somebody crucial to education and crucial to our lives, is the one that puts having an authentic life at the center of philosophy. That to be fully alive, to have values that are genuinely your own and that you can stand up for, so to speak. That's the Socrates who's truly great. The other one, the one that I think often appeals to adolescents who are studying philosophy for the first time sometimes, appeals in one way, so they like being clever. I guess it's just a matter of being clever. The one that is the same one that very often alienates and doesn't appeal, especially to those who don't feel very good at word games or asking questions. But it seems to me that if we want to see the Socrates, as it were, we ought to enshrine as the father figure of philosophy, as really this other one, the one who says, to be alive as a human being is to live the examined life. So that's why I love the title, Emergency Socrates Talks, because it struck me that once you see what Socrates is about, you realize that all his talks are about matters of life and death. They're all emergency Socrates talks. Thank you. And since Socrates loves questions, I invite them. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you might want to raise, whatever they are. I know it's always a little hard to crack the ice on questions. So someone with courage needs to ask the first one.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm very interested in the relationship between faith and reason, religion and philosophy. Our family decided to send our daughter to parochial school because we felt that that was essential to the good life. And I'm wondering what you think about that, whether that is contrary to what Plato would call the examined life, because we start with faith?
So I missed one thing in your question. I heard the conflict between faith and reason, but I didn't hear which school you sent your child to, your daughter.
We sent her to Covenant Christian Academy.
I see.
It was in 99th Street on the south side.
Okay. Well, let me say that every fall at the University of North Carolina, I teach a class called Making Sense of Ourselves to 200 students, freshmen and up, which is very largely about secular versus religious ways of thinking. And in North Carolina, a lot of our students have Christian backgrounds, have very often very strong ones. And a huge problem, at least it has been a problem for me, is to let them see that interpretative questioning of their values is not, as yet, criticism of them or dismissal of them. that's quite difficult because I think very often they're sensitive, think that their values are going to be criticized negatively. And I don't see I don't think, even at the end of the day, one might be critical of certain Christian values, whatever. I think that if you can't get a sensitive Christian to see that, you bring them to the point where they see that there is a problem themselves, and that problems are not something to be afraid of. There's a marvelous, so I always forget the French poet who said this, so I'm going to try to spend time remembering his name. But he says, a problem is a light, a paradox is a sun. A problem is something that you're alive and thinking through. So a living faith, if I could put it in that way, should be questioning, not in the trivial sort of sense of dismissive questioning, but rather wholehearted engagement with central and difficult questions. I don't see any between, as it were, the kind of faith I might want my children to have, say, and the kind of critical philosophical thinking I'd want to make. I don't directly see a conflict.
Mentioned that it was also a classical school.
Yeah. So, and actually, one of the things that one of the most effective strategies that I've found to simultaneously dampen the fears of fundamentalist Christian students, the ones who feel their faith is very important to their lives, to sort of, assuage their fears and at the same time dampen their dogmatism, which is sometimes they tend to just make expressions of faith in their discussion sections as if that puts an end to it, right? There's a way, the Lord hath said, and then they think, that's what I think and that's the end of it. And what I think is very effective actually is to bring to bear the resources of classical scholarship, because very many of them, they don't know any language besides English, and often their grip on that isn't as tight as one might wish. But they often have no idea of what it is to establish, say, a text of the gospel or a text of the Bible, how much of the resources of reason and scholarship and science and so on are required to date ancient documents and say to establish what the sacred text actually is requires a huge amount of those things that they see as threats, reason, science, all that secular stuff that seems to be always antithetical to faith, is actually crucial to establishing the very documents that embodies their teaching. It's curiously effective, in part because I think it says, I have a lot more to learn about my own faith than I thought, and it's not simply something that I can stand up for by uttering some things that I've heard in church. I have to think more about it. Thank you for that. It's a very good question to raise.
Hi. Excuse me. I work all across the city supporting teachers in K-8 classrooms and their students. And I see on and off Socratic seminar being implemented in lots of different ways. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about maybe how you ask your college students and your grad students questions in your classroom, and if you have any advice on what you've seen work with younger children in terms of really digging into leading and facilitating and teachers being a part of the conversation.
I think, let me see if this is, I just want to make sure that I'm getting your question correct. And I think that sometimes there are teaching methods, so to speak, that emulate Socratic conversations. And some classes are set up in part to have people participate and raise questions in the way that Socratic interlocutors do. Is that roughly speaking what you had in mind?
Yeah. There's sort of, Yes.
Yeah, let me tell you a bit of history. So for the first 25 years of my life as a teacher, I taught at Reed College in the Pacific Northwest in Portland. And Reed College is set up so that all of its classes are modeled on Socratic questioning. They're all called, gosh, I can't remember what they're called anymore. But they're all discussion-based. All the classrooms are seminar classrooms. Everyone sits around, and actually they read a curriculum that's rather like the Great Books curriculum at the University of Chicago, and they come every conferences, they're called, come to conference every week, ready to ask questions, question each other, discuss, and there's a minimum outside of certain subjects of lecturing. And so for 25 years I taught that way, and I think it's a very good way, but it works only with small classes. It's very difficult to teach a large class. Socrates himself refused to do it with more than one person. And I was like, no, you can't cross-examine a group. You have to, it's a one-on-one business. And I think that, so when I moved to the University of North Carolina, where as I just said, I teach 200 students in one of my classes, it's not feasible to do it that way. But we do have so they have lectures Monday, Wednesday, and then on Friday, they have recitation sections, as they're called. I hope that's not an accurate description of what goes on in them, but where they have a chance to talk to TAs, teaching assistants, about the issues that are raised in lecture. I think at 25 students, that's way too big. It's very difficult, I think. That's one of the problems with Socratic. My own view when I was teaching at Reed, as class sizes grew in the time that I was there, 10 is pushing it. It's like a dinner party, right? About 6, that's good. Everyone, 8 chances of breaking into groups increases. Get a little bigger, you're not going to have a single conversation. You're going to have many. So, yeah, it's a wonderful way of teaching. It's very expensive. And I gotta just add one thing. As an undergraduate, I went to Trinity College Dublin, which is modeled on Oxford, Cambridge methods. So every week, I met a tutor. With my tutor, read a paper to him, and I'm afraid it was all hymns in those days, but that's changed. Read a paper and then had that criticized one-on-one. And again, that is a wonderful way to learn, and an expensive one.
Hi, going back to Socrates, do you treat him as historically accurate, the stories? And also at the pre-collegiate level, do you think it's important for kids to be familiar with the philosophers or simply the philosophies?
Nietzsche said there's no such thing as philosophy. There are only philosophers. And while I think that's an exaggeration, it comes closer to my own thoughts about the subject, which is that while it's in very many ways like a science, it's in very many other ways like an art. And the reason I say this is I think that the goal of science is to produce knowledge. And knowledge is something that you can get by proxy. If you know something and you tell it to me, I come to know it too. But philosophy is about understanding. And understanding is a personal thing. You can't understand for me. And because you understand, I can't get it from you just by having you tell it to me. It doesn't become understandable to me. So I see philosophy as, in that sense, more personal. And that's why I think of it as more a matter of what philosophers in particular are like, particular philosophers are like. But let me segue now back onto the first question and then come back to the second one again. The first question is, are the dialogues, reports of conversations are historically accurate? And this is a bit like the question of the true Jesus, what did he really say? And I think there's a fair consensus among scholars that something like the following is true. The Apology is probably fairly historically accurate. That is, Plato is not just reporting his, making a story, but a story with a lot of truth in it about the trial. Increasingly thereafter, Plato uses Socrates as a device for thinking out his own thoughts. And we've got a lot of evidence from Aristotle about this that might take seriously. But, there's a point at which Plato begins to deviate from that early figure. So I suppose, I've written some stuff about this, but it's hard to get your heart into it. There's so little evidence that really it becomes special pleading for some particular way to read the dialogues. Yeah. I think in teaching philosophy, it's important to do two things. All my teaching is text-focused. That is, it's always based on some great book. I think this is, for me at least, by far the best way to teach it. So even if I were teaching a, quote, problems course, and frankly, I'm not big on those, but I'd still want to start, because I think it's with a great book, because I think it's incredibly important for young philosophers, and old philosophers too, for that matter, to be in constant contact with a truly great mind. There's nothing like it, and just the way that I would say that if you were a painter, you should be in constant contact with great paintings, great painters, and in the same way, if you want to be a great musician, right? In that sense, I think, again, there's a personal dimension to it. You want to see in a truly great philosophical mind how these things work out. You don't just want to get this, I think, there's a lack of depth if you think that philosophy is just a series of puzzles, but ahistorical puzzles that we can give answers to. That doesn't mean that sometimes in teaching philosophy, a way to hook a group on an issue isn't to start with a problem. But the next step, it seems to me, is to see that problem being developed in the hands of a master. That's my take on it.
A question regarding philosophy's moral imperative. Am I correct in assuming that Socrates is inferring that there's an afterlife? And does his moral imperative come from that afterlife?
I'm not sure I know what a moral imperative is in this question, but I think that Socrates' thought is, as I would reconstruct it, might be something like this. The question for anybody, so to speak, is, what kind of a life am I going to have? What kind of a life should I have? How am I going to live? What do I think's important? What matters? And to some degree, that might or might not as yet be a moral question, because it might be that I think that moral values are important only if they matter, only if they matter to having a life that's worth living. So I might not think that they just matter as moral imperatives, so to speak, like you have to follow me no matter what you want. It might be that you think, no, the justification of them is downstream from what a really worthwhile life would be. And to some degree, that's how I think that's the right way to think about them. So Socrates, as I see him, like this, thinks eudaimonia, or the well-lived life, living well, is the central thing to focus on. And then the ethical virtues, or the moral values, fall out of that because you wouldn't be able to register correctly other values if you didn't have the moral virtues. I tried to express that. This would make a lot more defense than I've given it, but just a sketch of the way that, say, courage plays in life. Courage is valuable to the well-lived life, because if you don't have courage, you'll misvalue what's dangerous and what isn't. And that's going to have a big impact on your life. You're intemperate. You won't, when it comes to your appetites, you'll make misjudgments of what's important and what isn't. So I was bringing in, quote unquote, moral values at a second step, and then justifying them by their impact on what the well-lived life is. I don't think that Socrates directly thinks this, be just for justice's sake, be good for goodness' sake. I think that he thinks those things are intrinsically valuable or really worthwhile because of the contribution they make to the good life or the well-lived life. Does that help? Yeah.
If it's found that the physical solution to the mind-body problem was found to be true, how would this affect Socrates' view on the authentic life? Like, would it be able to exist if they're in the absence of a soul? And if it doesn't exist, would the biological life then take precedence over the authentic life?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. That's true. The view of what it is to have the authentic life, biological life distinction is neutral with respect to whether or not we survive our biological death. But it's rather, it puts our biological death in a certain kind of perspective. Because this is something that we know to be true, and we have to find a way to make sense of it. That there are very many things, or at least some, for each of us, I think, that, or for most of us, we would sacrifice our biological life for, even if we don't believe that we have eternal lives of our own, even if we think that the sacrifice of our biological life will be the end of it. I mean, suppose I lay down my life for my friend, right? And I don't think that I'm going to survive. What happens? How are we to make sense of that? Well, one of the ways we do it is we think there's something more important than biological life. Now, take another one. You know, someone is being tortured to betray their ideals, right? As, say, Jews were tortured in the Spanish Inquisition to renounce their Judaism. Now, in a case like that, again, what you say is, the life that I would lose were I to go on biologically living at that cost would be a life that was no longer authentic for me. Right? I would no longer have any of me in it. I would have lost something else, even though I was biologically taking over. In a way, I think the reason I want to say that it's a life that you lose is because I think that's the right way to think of it. We can spin it out in various ways, but it seems to me that what's most important to you? What makes life worth living? What gives you meaning? What expresses you? That's going to be lost. And what's going to be left is an animal life ticking over. Right? So that's why I want to make it that way. But you're quite right, it doesn't presuppose this. Of course, it could be. I think that when I try to explain to myself what people have wanted to mean by the immortality of the soul, I mean something like this, that authentic life doesn't end except by its betrayal. There's a way in which there's something sort of eternal about it. I don't know, we find ourselves talking the same way about love, right? That love doesn't die, right? Love, those kinds of things. When we say things like that, we're struggling to articulate something, which is something like this, that only certain kinds of things can attack love, and biological death is not one of them. If your beloved dies loving you, that's very different. Biologically dies, I mean, while loving you, is very different than if she betrays you or abandons you for somebody else or whatever. We think it's an attempt, as it were, to make some sense of thoughts that are otherwise, to me, inaccessible ones about what immortal life would be like and so on.
In the interest of time, this is going to be the last question. Hello.
Hi.
So, you mentioned in the beginning that there's some sort of like arrogance that often comes across when people try to take arrogance.
I missed that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
There's some sort of arrogance that comes across sometimes
Yes.
for people when they read Socrates, and it's true that myself included, when someone say questions your beliefs and values, people often become upset.
Yeah.
And also, there's this element of there is some arrogance to it if you were to say model yourself on Socrates and think of yourself as coming down from the mountaintop to help the people learn how to live a good life. Is there a way, I guess, how would you say to bring the Socratic method into conversation without alienating people and sort of misuse it, like completely disregarding tact? Like, do you think that tact has a place in the Socratic method in the classroom, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to say something about it. This to me is one of the hardest things to accept about Socrates. When I first encountered him as a student, I was a bumptious, smart, aggressive guy, and I loved that. I thought, kill them all. So, yeah, okay, you think you're smart? Okay, I can think of 10 things that are wrong with what you just said. Let me show you what they are. No. I felt like a gunslinger, and I was quick on the draw. I went to Cornell, to graduate school, and I was encouraged by my thesis advisor, Sidney Shoemaker, to break a tradition or restore an ancient one and be a graduate student who gave a talk at the faculty seminar, weekly seminar group. It was a very aggressive group, and I was a little timid, but at the same time, I thought, being invited to do this really great thing. So I gave a talk, and it was responded to by Bob Stalnaker. If you're in contemporary philosophy, he was for a long time at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a very smart man. He completely destroyed it. I mean, he just took it apart, right? And I'd met somebody who was quicker on the draw than I was, and I got pretty beat up, It really had a very big effect, I would say. I stopped that. I didn't want to be a sharp gun anymore. I mean, there's a place for cleverness in philosophy, and some philosophers are extremely clever, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you're quite right that, the sense of the clever person coming down into the cave, if I can use that Platonic image, and then sort of enlightening with a superior, and I don't think that's a very good teaching method. And that's something that I think is edgy about Socrates. Now, Socrates is not as bad as he seems. That's the first thing to say. If we see him questioning smart guys, wannabes, Protagoras, Gorgias, right? People who claim to know, or Euthyphro, people who say, I'm an expert, I know. He's aggressive. But when he talks to young people, as he does, for example, in the Lysis, about friendship, two young boys who've fallen in love with each other, they really want to know what love is, what friendship is. Socrates is completely sweet. He suggests answers to questions. He doesn't just shoot them down. And so I don't think he's all one thing. Socrates has another side, which is not as thematized or not as present in textbooks as the more aggressive side. But I think that questioning is, anyone who's ever been in psychoanalysis or read anything about it knows, questioning is a very delicate matter. And the one thing that I'd say that's on Socrates' side here, and I don't think that it's ironical, I think it's genuine, is Socrates comes forward as somebody who does not himself know, as an inquirer along with you, and who denies that he can play the role of an authority in your life. So it's never this. You can never say, I think it because Socrates says, as other teachers might. And in that sense, he's encouraging, very difficult matter, to you establish in yourself the kind of authority that comes when you're able to defend your position. By the way, as somebody at the University of Chicago that I greatly admire as one of the best writers about this is Jonathan Lear on Socratic irony, and about irony as a way of, not what we think of it, but irony as a way of, not becoming an authority figure for students in a way that prevents them from having an authentic life of their own, so to speak. That's a long answer to your question. I don't know if it helped at all, but that's what I moved to say about it. Thank you.
But I think we'd better keep going along. He's done a wonderful job of setting up questions, problems that we need to be considering as we proceed, the meaning of philosophy and how on earth you could translate that into pre-collegiate philosophy. And our next speaker is going to help us think about that subject directly. Janna Marie-Alone is the founder of the University of Washington Center for Philosophy for Children. Since 1995, she's taught philosophy in classrooms from preschool to college, as well as taught college students, K-12 teachers, parents, and others about ways to bring philosophy into the lives of young people. She's the author of The Philosophical Child, which explores ways that parents, grandparents, and other adults can stimulate philosophical conversations about children's questions. And she co-edited the book Philosophy and Education, Introducing Philosophy to Young People, which examines various issues involved in teaching philosophy to young people. She's a frequent writer and speaker about pre-collegiate philosophy. She's the president of Plato, the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization, and chair of the American Philosophical Association's Committee on Pre-College Instruction in Philosophy, founding editor-in-chief of the journal Questions, Philosophy for Young People. Very fortunate to have her here today. Please give Janna Marie-Alone a warm welcome.
Good morning. So I think I'd like to start with a story about my oldest son, because when I think about, the title of my talk is Philosophy and Education, Why Philosophy for Children? And when I think about why philosophy for children, for me, that really began with my own children. So when I was a graduate student working on my PhD in philosophy, my oldest son, Will, was around 4 or 5 years old. And we love to read Arnold Lobel's Frog and Toad stories together. So those of you who have or have had young children probably know these stories. They're really interesting, very philosophically suggestive. So one evening we were reading the story The Dream, which is from Frog and Toad together. And in the story, Toad has a dream about starring in a play. And in the dream, his best friend, Frog, sits in the theater watching. As Toad performs, Frog starts shrinking until finally he can no longer be seen or heard. And Toad is getting progressively more anxious, starts screaming for Frog, and then wakes up and finds Frog standing right by his bed. "Frog, is that really you?" Toad asks. Frog assures him that it is. Toad, utterly relieved, spends a, quote, "fine long day" with Frog. So after reading this story one evening, Will and I began talking about dreams, about some of the dreams he'd had, and about how real the dream in the story had seemed to feel to Toad. Do you ever have dreams that feel so real that you wake up and for a little while you're not sure if it was a dream? I asked. Yes, Will responded. And then sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming when I'm actually awake. I mean, could we be in a dream right now? What makes you ask that? Well, how do you know we're not? Do you think that there are differences between the way dreams feel and the way being awake feels? I asked. Well, dreams usually feel weird, like things happen in them that would never happen in real life. But not always, right? I said. You said sometimes a dream feels so real you're not sure later it was a dream. Yeah, so it could be that I'm dreaming right now. So these were the kinds of questions that I was finding Will asking, questions that I recognized as deeply philosophical, questions like, what is fairness? Can you be happy and sad at the same time? Are thoughts real? And until that time, I had never really thought of children as having philosophical capacities. I guess if I had thought about it, I probably would have assumed they didn't. But then I started remembering my own childhood and the way I used to ask questions: why am I here? What is the meaning of life? What does it mean to be a good person, etc.? And so I started wondering about kids this age generally, and whether in fact philosophical propensity starts way earlier than graduate school or college. So I talked Will's kindergarten teacher into letting me come in and do some philosophy sessions with a group of 5-year-olds. And I will always remember my first class, because I'd taught undergraduates, but I had never taught children, and I was a completely a nervous wreck. And I show up at the kindergarten class with, again, Arnold Lobel, Frog and Toad Together, the story Dragons and Giants, which for those of you who don't know it, it's a great story in which Frog and Toad are trying to figure out if they're brave or not. And the way they figure it out is they climb this mountain and they do all these things that are really intimidating to them. And at the end of the story, they race back down the mountain. One of them hides under the bed, one of them hides in the closet, and they exclaim to each other how wonderful it is to feel so brave. And so the question very nicely raises, what does it mean to be brave? And I had this lovely conversation with these 5-year-olds about whether bravery always involves fear. I mean, they thought bravery meant doing something that's hard, that's scary maybe for you. And so if that's the case, then if you're not afraid, can you actually be brave, or are you just being reckless or something like that? And I should say, so one of my happiest discoveries as a parent and a graduate student was that children's books are deeply philosophically suggestive. I would especially put in a plug for Arnold Lobel, one of my favorites, but many children's books actually seem to recognize that children have philosophical propensities in the way that other people don't seem to really assume. So now that class led to another class, led to another class. I've now been talking with children about philosophical questions in various capacities, from kindergarten through high school, with my own children and other children, for about 17 years. And I've come to see that children, most children, if not all children, have what I think of as philosophical selves, the part of us that wonders about our own experiences and the world, that questions the meaning of the human condition. And in recent years, this movement to introduce philosophy in schools, to introduce philosophical thinking to children and to help them to develop this part of themselves, has gained ground. There are a wealth of ways to bring philosophy into K through 12 education. Philosophers in the schools programs, like the one at our Center for Philosophy for Children at the University of Washington, which we've been running for about 15 years in the Seattle Public Schools. After-school philosophy sessions and other resource programs provided by organizations like Winning Words and at University of Chicago. High school philosophy classes and elementary school teachers introducing philosophy in their classrooms. People are talking about starting schools built around philosophy clubs and camps, etc. Dozens of programs introducing philosophy into the pre-college curriculum have been started at universities around the country, and more teachers are becoming interested in bringing philosophical inquiry into their classrooms. So why are we all doing this? Why does this matter? I think it matters because philosophy gives young people an avenue for exploring questions that are important to them. Questions such as the nature of identity, the meaning and purpose of being alive, and whether we can know anything at all. And as I said, this starts early. All parents and grandparents are aware of the why questions children ask, sometimes to a point where it drives us crazy. Why do I dream? Why do I have a mind? Why should I be fair? And despite that we all know about children asking these why questions, most people assume that children aren't capable of philosophical thinking. Why? I think there's two reasons. One is that philosophy is seen as kind of an esoteric discipline. In the United States, philosophy is not regularly taught in high schools as opposed to other countries in Europe and Latin America. And so many people have had no background in philosophy, and it feels very inaccessible. People outside of the profession don't seem to see their ordinary musings as philosophical, although in fact they are. Second, children are typically underestimated, and in no area is that truer, I think, than in their capacities for deep and sustained reflection about the world into which they've been born. So as a result, we easily miss children's philosophical questions. We just don't hear them. We fail to notice the profoundly serious thinking that underlie many of their remarks. We've already assumed philosophy is too difficult or too abstract for them, and that children are incapable of appreciating philosophical issues. So, when they do make them, young children's deeper questions are frequently treated dismissively or condescendingly. How often do adults remark on a reflective or provocative comment made by a child by pointing out how adorable or amusing the comment seems, when a similar comment made by an adult or an older young person elicits a more thoughtful response? But in the now hundreds of conversations that I've had with children, it's clear to me that most children are drawn to reflecting about the human condition and really want to engage in thinking about these issues. I've had so many young children, it happens every year, say to me things like, "I think about these questions all the time." So how do we do this then? So in my view, actually, in some ways different from what David said, I think that addressing philosophical questions, at least with younger children, say pre-high school, is a very different matter than addressing philosophical questions in, say, an undergraduate philosophy class. And I think it requires that we play a much different role than the ordinary, teacher as repository of wisdom role. And I think it's one of the reasons that adults often shy away from engaging with children when they ask philosophical questions. We're used to giving answers. We're used to being the advisors, the experts. We teach children how to tie their shoes, how to tell time. And so when a child asks us, what's the difference between believing and knowing, and we don't have a very clear answer about that because it's a very difficult, continued to be unsettled question, we're kind of stymied and we're not sure what to do. And so often I think adults are uncomfortable and diffident about engaging in these kinds of conversations. Really what it requires, in my view, is a shift from kind of out of the role of the expert into the role of a kind of co-inquirer, so that we're seeking with young people to better understand the philosophical dimension of our experiences, rather than teaching them about what the philosopher said, right? Of course, I studied philosophy. I think it's great to study the great philosophers, but if you walked into a second grade class and said, okay, I'm gonna teach you, Descartes' dream argument, they're not gonna care very much about that, right? But if you walk in and you say, dreams are really mysterious, aren't they? And you start to talk about the way in which dreams calls into question the way what we think we know about the world, then you can get them, right? So my hope is that children who get philosophy, who are able to talk about philosophical questions with their peers, then eventually will get to the place where they get really interested in what Descartes or et cetera have to say. So in these exchanges, when I go into a classroom, it's as much more of an equal, because we're both bringing something important to the enterprise. I'm bringing, presumably, a greater conceptual sophistication and life experience, and they're bringing a fresh perspective and an openness to exploring all possible views. Because what adults might sometimes characterize as children's naivete actually becomes a strength, because they tend to be unafraid to think about a question imaginatively. They're less worried about making a mistake or sounding silly, and they share their thoughts with relative unreservedness. And this allows for what the philosopher Gareth Matthews once called the free exploration of possibilities. Kind of anything's up for grabs, as long as you can give a reason for why this might make sense. Even if it sounds crazy, we'll take it seriously. So for example, in a recent fourth grade class I was leading, the children were exploring a question. And when I go into a classroom, I generally don't come in saying, okay, we're going to talk about free will today. I'll bring a story like a frog and toad story, and then the children will ask the questions that they think are interesting, and they'll vote on, or we'll come up with some way of deciding what question we're going to discuss. So in this particular class, one of the students asked, does everything have a right to life? And most of the children responded initially that yes, they thought everything had a right to life. So I said, okay, so if everything has a right to life, does that mean that when I swat and kill a mosquito because it's about to bite me, I'm engaging in a moral wrong, I'm doing something that's wrong? Well, maybe, one child replied. I mean, if you get bit by a mosquito, it's not going to kill you. And so it seems unfair that a mosquito should die so you won't get bit. But if you were in a country where mosquito bites could kill you, it would be different, another child said, like if you could catch malaria or something. And mosquitoes need to bite humans to live, observed a third child. If you have to do something to survive, it seems like there should be less negative consequences than if you just want to hurt someone else for fun. I think everything has a right to life, but every right to life is not equal, suggested another student. What do you mean? I asked. Well, I think everything starts off with a right to life. All creatures that are alive have a right to life, but not all of these rights are equal. It depends on how important you are to the whole environment. People think human beings are the most important, but we might not be. I agree, replied a student. If all the humans died, it probably would cause greater harm than if all the mosquitoes were gone. But that doesn't mean that nothing is more valuable than people. We just think that people are the most important, put in another student, but that's just because we're people. That's right, said a student. You always see things from your own perspective. I mean, mosquitoes probably think they're the most important beings on the planet. Imagine living on a planet where we were tiny and there were these giant mosquitoes that were constantly swatting at us whenever we got near them. We wouldn't think that just because we were smaller and less powerful, that the giant mosquitoes had more of a right to life than we did. What you think about which creatures are the most important, responded the student, really depends on your attachments. I love that. We think people and dogs and cats and other pets are more important than mosquitoes, but that's just because we have relationships with them. If someone had a mosquito for a pet, they would probably see it differently. Okay, so this is the kind of dialogue in which young people's sort of inherent interest in these large questions are being explored in a way that engages their peers in a kind of, I guess what I would call an authentic dialogue that really emerges from the children. So whether it's reading picture books that raise these kinds of questions in elementary school or studying Kant with high school seniors, philosophical exploration in school should, I think, begins with students' inclinations to question the meaning of such concepts as truth, knowledge, identity, fairness, justice, morality, art, etc. This cultivates what I call philosophical sensitivity, which is kind of a way of seeing the world. This idea comes out of, actually an idea proposed by Aristotle, that we have certain perceptual capacities, ways of perceiving the world that can be developed with training and education. For Aristotle, this related to moral perception, the ability to understand easily what matters in a moral decision. So similarly, philosophical sensitivity is a kind of perceptual capacity that enables us to see the world in a particular way, to notice unexamined assumptions that underlie speech and behavior, and to recognize the philosophically puzzling aspects of the world that might otherwise elude us. And this involves the capacity to recognize and reflect about what are sometimes called existential questions, life, death, reality, as well as other philosophical issues such as knowledge, ethics, art and beauty, justice, etc. And this is, I think, an idea. There are many of these kinds of sensitivities. So, for example, an artist or an art critic has what I would consider to be aesthetic sensitivity. They've developed certain of their artistic sensibilities in the way most of us haven't, and will look at a painting and notice details and historical relationships that those of us who have not been so trained will miss. And similarly, go for a walk in the woods with a naturalist, and he or she will observe a web of interrelationships and features of the natural world that the rest of us just don't see. So like these ways of seeing, philosophical sensitivity changes how the world seems to us, helps us perceive more readily the often hidden layers of meaning and mystery in everyday experience. And as we cultivate it, these features of experience start to jump out at us all the time. And talking with kids enhances this. It really helps them to develop philosophical sensitivity. So why should we care about this? Why should philosophers, teachers, parents, etc., care about developing philosophical sensitivity in children? I think that introducing philosophy in pre-college classrooms yields reciprocal benefits to both K-12 education and to the discipline of philosophy. On the one hand, philosophy can strengthen and deepen pre-college education, and as a result, the lives of its students. And on the other hand, the discipline of philosophy can be enriched by the insights of young people and those who teach them. How so? So how can philosophy contribute to pre-college education? I think there's three ways. First, There is no better discipline for developing analytic and critical thinking capacities than philosophy, in my view. And particularly in contemporary life, it's essential to be able to evaluate information critically. More and more information is being presented at our children more and more rapidly, and being able to discern what is good information, what is not, to ask the kinds of critical questions that allow you to make those judgments is really important. Philosophy encourages students to question the assumptions that underlie our thinking and behavior, and engaging in philosophical inquiry trains young people to evaluate claims based on reason and analysis rather than on unexamined beliefs and prejudice. And because philosophical questions are complex and often can be approached from a broad range of perspectives, they require careful reasoning and intellectual effort. And so it thus facilitates student acquisition of some of the tools needed to become self-directed learners and independent thinkers, and it fosters the emergence of a kind of critical and questioning attitude to the world. Second, I think that introducing philosophy in schools facilitates an appreciation by students of the wide variety of perspectives with which the world can be viewed. By definition, a question of philosophy does not have one settled answer. The experience of becoming aware that there are many ways to see the same thing, all of them unique and valuable, is powerful. Philosophy can teach us that any view must be taken seriously, no matter how outlandish it seems, if there are good reasons offered for it. And especially in this time of human history where greater and greater presumed certainty about knowledge, identity, moral beliefs, and the conditions for a good life lead people to extreme acts of violence and oppression, it's imperative that our students grasp that there are a multitude of ways to understand the world. As one of my third grade students said recently, it doesn't frustrate me that we don't have the answers to these questions. I like hearing what other people think about them, because there's so many different ways people think about things. That's what's great about philosophy. You realize not everyone sees things the same way. Finally, when we try to answer children's questions, I think, we fail to make a space for them to gain experience questioning and examining their own experiences and ideas. Philosophy is really grounded in questioning. And often I think in philosophy it's the question that matters most, and not necessarily reaching a final answer. We strive for understanding, but we often know that actually getting a final answer to the question with which we're struggling is unlikely. And by contrast, K-12 education really doesn't generally value questions. Public education, I think, actually often discourages questioning. When teachers pose questions in classrooms, frequently they're not attempting to initiate an inquiry about the subject or just demonstrate the value of questioning, but they're seeking a specific answer from the students, and the students are trying to figure out what it is they're supposed to say, right? Students actually spend, I think, significant parts of schooling trying to figure out the right answer to the question being asked by teachers, whether aloud or on tests. And much of what goes on emphasizes knowing or finding the right answers, as if we should all have utter clarity about all of these questions. But as philosopher Matthew Lipman once pointed out, it's when our knowledge of the world is revealed to be, quote, ambiguous, equivocal, and mysterious, end quote, that students are most inspired to think about the world. Questions are the key to articulating that mystery and ambiguity. They're the gateways to inquiry. And asking good questions is an essential skill for evaluating the flood of information that children face, for gathering what they need to make good decisions, and for conveying the gaps in their understanding of particular topics or situations. The more skilled students become at constructing good questions, the more they'll be able to think clearly and competently. And so I think that philosophy can transform classrooms, and I've seen it happen where classrooms move from places that run on right answers into spaces where where there's a comfort with uncertainty, where inquiry is welcome. And transforming classrooms in this way really supports genuine learning on the part of students, because too often our experiences in schools are memorizing what's needed to demonstrate skills in a particular subject rather than learning anything in any really deep way. I often think to myself when I'm up there talking in a classroom at the college level, so, you're teaching, but is anybody really learning anything, right? And what does it really mean to be a teacher? I think that the deepest and most authentic kind of teaching and learning occurs when students participate in thinking about a subject, and they're not just passive recipients of what's being taught. And then a new clarity emerges for them personally. And encouraging children to think, and young people to think deeply about questions that interest them help make these kinds of experiences possible. And it's sustaining their sense of wonder and deepening their awareness of the multidimensionality of human life. Philosophy's emphasis on questioning and independent thinking, on uncertainty rather than certainty, can enliven classrooms. As one of my elementary school students once said, philosophy can change the way you think about everything. And I think that's right. I think philosophy is all about changing the way we think about everything. Not necessarily what we think, but the way we think. An approach to living in which few answers are accepted unchallenged, philosophical inquiry aims at pushing us to remain alive to the puzzles and mysteries that swirl unnoticed around virtually our every move. The most mundane activities of our everyday lives are laden with philosophical questions, and engagement with some of these questions makes the classroom and our lives far richer. So that's, I think, how K through 12 philosophy can be enlivened and enhanced by, or K through 12 education can be enlivened and enhanced by philosophy. So how can the philosophy profession be enriched by K through 12 philosophy? My favorite description of philosophy comes from philosopher Robert Johann, who said, quote, "Philosophical inquiry is, at its best, an adventure in making life whole," end quote. When we do philosophy in K through 12 classrooms, we start from the questions that are important to the young people, and the ensuing dialogues take place on many levels: intellectual, social, emotional, imaginative. There's a wholeness to the enterprise that comes from this multi-level engagement. And the investment of our whole selves in this adventure involves both the intellectual and the emotional dimensions of philosophical inquiry. So I think this experience can transform academic philosophy in two main ways. First, in a time that the discipline continues to grow increasingly narrow and specialized, dialogues about meaningful questions that are conducted without jargon or reference to the experts can reawaken for many people the passion for philosophical questions that brought those of us in the discipline to the discipline in the first place. Moreover, engaging in philosophical inquiry with pre-college students affords us access to young people's novel and imaginative insights about questions that matter to all of us. I never come out of a classroom, and even if I've talked about the subject with kids, dozens of times, without some new insight, some new way of thinking about the problem that we've been exploring. Adults tend to assume that children's thinking is always less mature than that of adults, and that therefore they can offer little to what we already know. But childhood is more than just a stage of adults in training. Every stage of life has its own way of seeing the world and can't just be reduced to preparation for the stages that follow. And so the insights of childhood, which we often lose when we reach adulthood, we can get access to that by listening to children think about some of these questions, and that enlarges and expands our perspectives. The sensibilities of children, new to the world and open to novel possibilities, can help us step away from the insulation of our long-held beliefs and approach to the world and to philosophy, and reawaken our awareness of the perplexities inherent in the most ordinary things. Finally, I think that inviting young people to participate in philosophy and in philosophical conversations has the potential to raise philosophy's visibility and widen its reach. As we know, philosophy is a foreign subject to most people, and for children and adults, because it's not taught in schools. And generally, people take a course in college, or if they don't, they never get any philosophy in this country. So bringing philosophy into schools can help lift the discipline from the margins of societal discourse and raise awareness of what a philosophical approach can offer to our collective thinking about ethics, social and political problems, etc. Instead of being what many people think of as an esoteric subject that's cloistered in the academy, philosophy should really belong to all of us. It pushes us to remain alive to the strangest of our experiences, to the unresolved questions that underlie most of what we say, do, and think, and helps us maintain our awareness of the world as marvelous and mysterious. Thank you. And I think we have a little time. I'm happy to take questions.
I'm a K-5 teacher, and just wondering what you do. Do you actually use the term philosophy when you start talking about this with children? I think a lot of teachers do this in their classrooms with literature, specifically primary literature. And just wondering if you actually use the term philosophy when you're speaking with kids.
We do. So the first time I ever come into a classroom, what I'll usually do, I'll write philosophy on the board, and then ask the students, what do you think of when you hear this word, philosophy? What does it mean? And then we'll have a discussion about what they think philosophy is and what it might be, and the involvement of questions, et cetera. And I really like reclaiming the term philosophy for children, because I think what these questions they have, the wondering about various subjects, is doing philosophy, and so I like to reclaim that for them. We give them at the end of the year. Often there are a lot of classes we go every week all throughout the school year, and at the end of the before the summer, we'll give them little buttons that say things like, we have different ones like big Y, and then I'm a philosopher, or philosophy rocks, or whatever. So yeah.
I think critical engagement with the children and being like a co-questioner with them is a very important aspect. But as a more scholared philosopher, do you feel that you have, and obviously it can be very subjective depending on the individual, but do you feel like you have a responsibility to also provide the children, or at least guide them towards what you feel are the right answers? And where is the line that you don't stifle their own philosophical quest because you don't believe in, say, dualism or another concept that they start to then kind of go with? Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess there's two ways to think about that. In terms of the content, what's the right answer to, a question about dualism, for example? I do not try and steer them towards what I might think is the correct conclusion, and at all, because I really think it's important for them. I'm not there to provide my wisdom about the nature of free will or something. I'm there to help them think about these questions together. But in terms of the process, there's a lot that I do to push them to give reasons for what they're thinking, to see if they've said two things that are contradictory, to help them connect to what other people have said. One of the things I always do when I come into a classroom the first time is I actually read them a chapter from Stuart Little, and I do this all the way through high school. I actually do this with my undergraduates too. That is a part of Stuart Little. I don't know if you know the story of Stuart Little. It's a wonderful book, and Stuart is this very interesting character because he's born of human parents, but he looks and is the same size as a mouse, and so it raises this great question about what is he? Is he, a mouse with human parents? Is he human who looks like a mouse? Whatever. Anyway, there's a great chapter where he becomes a substitute teacher for a day, and he basically waltzes into this classroom knowing nothing about education. He sees the principal by the side of the road crying, and the principal gets him to be a substitute teacher because he doesn't have a teacher in his classroom. And he gets the students to think about what the important things are, and then what are the rules that we should put together to make sure we can keep the important things. So I always do this with kids the first philosophy session, and they always come up with a list of rules that we then keep as our rules for philosophy. And almost always one of the rules that they come up with is make sure what you say connects to what other people are saying. And so I'll help them to do that. I'll remind them of their rules, did you give a reason for that, or how does that, et cetera. But so I'm very focused on the process of thinking and pushing them to keep the discussion philosophical, to recognize when there's a question that's really philosophical and ask some questions that might have the philosophy emerge. But in terms of this, the philosophical views themselves and pushing my own views about, the good life or whatever on them, no, I'm really careful not to do that.
All right, hi. How important do you believe is a previous interest in philosophy?
How important do I believe is a previous interest in philosophy? So if I'm talking about, say, kindergarten students, I guess I would say I've never met a kindergarten student who doesn't have an interest in philosophy, that they generally would not characterize it in that way. But if I ask them, what do you think are some interesting questions? I always get questions that are deeply philosophical. That would be in any introductory philosophy textbook, right? So now if I ask middle school students, do you have an interest in philosophy, and they haven't had philosophy before, it's interesting. I mean, the kindergartners are just alive with questions. But by the time they get to 7th grade, you really have to work to get the students for those questions to emerge. So, and by then I would say maybe there are some students who are just not very interested in this, right? I would still say, I guess, that most students, there's at least some of what we do that interests them, right? I mean, some particular question about justice, say, or whatever, that does grab them. So I guess I think everyone's naturally interested in philosophy, and the trick is to get them early enough that they want to keep exploring it. There might be a kindergartner who's not interested in philosophy. I just haven't met one, or they're good at faking it or something.
Has there been any research about how having a philosophical education as a kid makes your mind differ from when you don't have education in philosophy?
Yeah, there have been some studies. Some are better than others, in my view. There is one that was done by an educational psychologist in Scotland that was really good, which basically that he used both. So he used a control group, and he used both a standardized test, one of the very typical intelligence test or standardized tests that's out there, and he videotaped the classrooms. And so he showed both that on this sort of logic reasoning test, the scores went up, and also, and this was, I think the students, this was like 4th and 5th grade, and they had a year of philosophy, and also showed how much more the students were engaging in classroom discussion, how much more likely they were to initiate questions, et cetera, after having philosophy. And there's also was a study that replicated that in Texas that I think has some problems, but there's some interesting results in that one too. We actually in Seattle have not done a study. We've talked about doing one. I guess I have mixed feelings about those things, even though it's probably something we should do. We just haven't spent the time and the money. It's expensive to do. To do a really good study is expensive. And so we haven't taken the time to do it. But there's lots of research out there. As I say, some of it's better than others. But most of it does tend to show that ability to do these sort of standardized tests and to be kind of more confidently engaging in classroom discussion is enhanced.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Does anybody? Okay.
I'm a 6th grade social studies teacher, and I'm trying to, I guess, cultivate this activist sort of way of living in my classroom. And what do you see in your teaching as the connection between living this examined life, and maybe this as, a life or death sort of question, and a connection to that in activism and building activism in the students?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think, for example, and I guess I think that probably the most powerful way to build activism or engagement in the community, participatory way of life, right, is to have the students think for themselves about what justice means, what being a community member means, what their universe of obligation is, who they have obligations to take care of, I mean, all these kinds of things. And then once you work through those questions, then the obvious question is, so what do you do about it, right? I mean, so I think there's a real tie between philosophy and, service learning, whatever you want to call it. I mean, sort of community engagement, and I've done some things with students where, like, I taught an 8th grade class for a long time, every year, a unit on moral philosophy and genocide. And as part of that, we ended up talking a lot about being a participatory member of society, about what it meant to be a bystander, et cetera. And then the students basically created a community project to right a wrong. I mean, something that they saw that they thought needed to be changed, and then we would work with them to help them then to create something to try and combat that. So I think there's lots of ways to do that, and I think it is really important to start with, I mean, as opposed to coming in and saying, okay, we're going to work on this project, we're going to, clean up the environment or whatever, to get them, to read them the Lorax and start talking about the environment and what's our obligations, right? Who is it that's responsible for the environment? Are we responsible? If so, how so, et cetera. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm incredibly pleased to have this set of panelists here for our first panel. They represent, of course, Janna Marie-Alone, you've just heard, and I'd like to thank her again for that perfect, wonderful talk. Our other panelists up here are people I've worked with for some time and admire immensely. Just to Janna's right is Dave McGill, who has been the director of the famous University of Chicago laboratory schools here for over a decade. He just announced his retirement this year, but he has been a brilliant successor to the original founder of Lab, our own John Dewey, America's philosopher. Lab started in 1896. It's grown. I think it's safe to say that it's one of the premier K-12 educational institutions in the world, and it's always had a strong emphasis on the humanities. A while back, when the Chicago teachers were on strike, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, Karen Lewis, pointed out that Rahm Emanuel's children actually attended the lab school. And she didn't take that as a criticism of Lab. Rather, she said, of course, the lab school is where everyone would like to send their kids. Look at all the art teachers, the humanities. So Dave is in an excellent position here to speak to the importance of the humanities, the state of the humanities in K-12 education today. To his right, Sarah Ray Stillinga, who is a senior director at the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute, associate clinical professor of the University of Chicago Committee on Education. We're thrilled to have the Urban Education Institute, UEI, here represented by her. This is a powerhouse educational research institution, and they have produced some of the best most thoughtful, careful research out there on what it takes to improve schools here in Chicago and across the country. Her own research has been especially concerned with issues of poverty in urban schools. I'm so pleased she's taught an adult education, continuing education course here at the U of C for some years on poverty and education in Chicago. She knows an enormous amount about the school system here and what it takes to improve education at that level. So please do give them a very, very, very enthusiastic welcome. And they're going to carry the ball and conduct the conversation themselves. Would you like to start?
Sure. Well, good morning. I'm David McGill, and as Bart indicated, I am the director of the laboratory schools, but you should know that prior to coming to to the University of Chicago in 2003, I was a public school educator for 32 years, including 20 years as a public school superintendent in the greater Philadelphia area. And I escaped when No Child Left Behind came in. And I'm grateful to that, and I'm grateful every morning I wake up and I go to the laboratory schools and I don't have to face the mandates that many of you have to face, and the pressures of making sure that my children do well on standardized testing. Because our children do well on standardized testing because they have the freedom and the safety of being at a place that has a philosophical base. We started this place in 1896, and the reasons to start a school to allow our children to experience education and to be totally engaged in their learning continue to this day. And although we don't teach Philosophy 101 to nursery school students, and by the way, we start at age 3, which I firmly believe in, and having experienced this now at the laboratory schools, I've decided that I'm going to pay my children to get the best preschool experience at age 3, even though they don't live in Chicago. Forget the college tuition, I do preschool. But I will tell you that, to have that kind of freedom at a school to really start at age 3 to ask big questions, to set the safety where children can be free to express themselves. And as long as they have the attention span to sit together for even 20 seconds or 30 seconds, there are those kinds of possibilities with 3-year-olds. And we don't have a Philosophy 101 at the high school, but if you take a look at how our teachers teach in a very seminar approach with Socratic types of questions, and we even arrange our classrooms beginning at the 6th grade to sit around a table where everybody is equal. And having that opportunity to have that equality of speech and freedom of speech throughout our curriculum is something that is a real true joy. So I appreciate those of you who are in public education. That's where I thought I would always be. I didn't realize I would have this opportunity to be at a school that was based upon a philosopher who believed that a democratic society can be enhanced and enriched by the educational system, and at a place that didn't have to meet some of the onerous mandates that many of you have. So that's a little bit about me, and look forward to having more of a dialogue with you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you. I'm Sarah Stalinga, and one thing that I just want to open with is saying how wonderful it is and important it is to have such a diverse group of people, such as yourselves, talking about issues like this across age and race and the kind of background that you bring or the experiences you have where you're working. I think this is a really rare thing in education for a group this diverse to be sitting together, especially with students in the mix. And so I commend the organizers and all of you for being here to have this dialogue. It's very important. I thought I'd talk a little bit about myself and about the Institute, and then draw a couple of connections between how I think the Institute's work is connected to the topic that you're discussing today. And so talking about myself, the reason that I wanted to highlight some of my own experiences is because I think the reason that I'm sitting here with you today is because of my own background and my own connection to this philosophy of education approach, my belief in that, and my own kind of sculpting and molding as an individual that's resulted from having that type of education myself and believing in that type of education. I'm the product of a public school in St. Paul, but it was a school that had a program in it called the Quest program, which was devoted to exactly this kind of thinking, the kind of education that David was just talking about, of sitting seminar style in circles, debating Plato. And to have that happen in a public high school was a very unusual thing when I was going to school. And then beyond that, having a school that was really organized around that way of thinking and devoted to that way of thinking I think, is what brought me to the University of Chicago, to the college to begin with, because I think the college at the University of Chicago, where I received my education, is also devoted to that kind of inquiry-based approach to learning and to integrating philosophy and inquiry-based thinking into every subject across the university. That was the draw for me when I came here, and that's the reason that I've stayed at the University of Chicago all these years, as now I turn around and teach classes in the college. I take that approach that I was educated in, both as a high school student and as an undergraduate, and I hope that what I'm trying to do is instill that same way of thinking and those same kind of philosophical questions into the education that I'm providing, both as I educate teachers in the Urban Teacher Education Program and to undergraduates and continuing education students here at the university. So I guess I start with that to say I have a passion for this conversation because it's so deeply instilled in my value set about what education is about to begin with. So the Urban Education Institute, we have 4 main bodies of work that we work on. We're actually a pretty big enterprise at the university. We have over 350 employees, so it's a pretty big operation, and we do 4 main things. The first thing we do is actually run schools every day here on the south side of Chicago. We have a pre-K through 12th grade school, and in some ways what we're trying to do with our charter school is to do what the lab school is doing. This idea of having a pre-K through 12 experience that's coherent and begins when children are very young and goes all the way through high school is a very unusual concept for public schools. Public schools tend to chunk up the educational experience, as you well know, into little pieces. And so what we're trying to do is emulate that kind of independent school approach for public school kids, with the idea that these kids especially need that coherent kind of pathway, both for their parents, but also to make sure that if we want them to go to college, that we have to have a coherent approach and a very rigorous approach to getting them there. So the one thing we do is educate kids. 4 campuses, 1,700 students every day here in the neighborhoods right around the University of Chicago. The second thing we do is we train urban teachers in something called the Urban Teacher Education Program. We're in our 10th year of training elementary teachers, and do we have any? I heard that there might be some UTEP graduates in the audience. Do you want to put your hands up? We have some UTEP teachers here. But the whole idea is a residency-based approach to training teachers, and so this means that our graduates spend an entire clinical year in their student teaching experience with the idea that becoming a teacher requires this rigorous approach to really digging deeply into classrooms over a long period of time. Especially preparing to work in urban contexts, that there's something that's special and unique and specific about the skill set required for that. The third thing we do is we have an applied research organization called the Consortium on Chicago School Research, which looks at Chicago public schools and reports to the public and to general citizenry and to practitioners about what's working and what isn't in terms of some of the programs and initiatives that are going on in the school system. And within that, creating indicators and ways of thinking about driving school improvement at the system level. And then finally, we have this little startup called UChicago Impact, which takes our research-based practice-proven tools and disseminates them nationally. So these are tools that have come out of resolving problems of practice that we have in our own work and trying to take those other places across the country. So what does this have to do with the topic of the conversation? How is this connected? As I thought about this, I think there's a couple of really important connections here. The first is that I think to instill philosophy into education in a systematic way requires a lot more than content. It requires more than just putting books or the right set of readings into classrooms, and you all know this if you're educators. It also requires a set of teachers and professionals in a school building with a particular way of thinking about education, so that they know how to take these tools that they've been given and turn them into action in the classroom that benefits students. And so I would argue that if we want to shift to this way of thinking, that we need to educate our professionals differently and help teachers to think about education differently than most traditional ways of training teachers approach this, especially in the public school system, as David said, which is much more focused on this skills-based approach to education. Second, I think we have to have a school organization that thinks about and values education in a different way than a traditional school. And we see this in the laboratory schools. We see classrooms that are organized around inquiry-based approaches. We see time put into the school day for practitioners to work and collaborate together to think more deeply about their practice. And so if we expect that this is going to happen systematically, then we need different kinds of schools. We need to kind of blow up this way of thinking about the way schools are organized. And third, I'm going to argue that we need school systems that are organized and think differently to do this well. So if we think about all three of these dimensions, I would argue that this is exactly what the Urban Education Institute is trying to do in our own work day to day, is to fundamentally push on and change practice and thinking about what education is for. The second connection that I think is really important has to do with social inequality and social justice. And I would argue, and there's a lot of research to support this, that this way of inquiry-based approach to education, of organizing educational experiences for students, and of training practitioners and teacher leaders and school leaders to think about education in this way of instilling philosophy into education, while it's rare in all schools in our country, it's virtually non-existent in public schools that serve low-income students of color. That there's a fundamental mismatch and difference between the kind of education and the kind of approach that's used day to day in most low-income, schools that serve low-income kids. And it's the rarest place that you will find this inquiry way of thinking. And I would argue that it's connected to a set of low expectations that we have for those students systematically in our country. And so I think that's the way that I would represent our connection to this work, is that fundamentally, I think we're trying to push on the boundaries of what education is in all of these different dimensions and the way schools and systems organize and the way that we think about education for our own students. But secondarily, I think when we push on these issues about philosophy and education, it's unavoidable, or rather we cannot avoid the idea that these experiences and this way of thinking is even less prevalent in the kinds of schools that we're working with across the city.
I'm just going to say a few things about our model of working with teachers in schools and then pose a question. So what we do at the University of Washington Center for Philosophy of Children, we made a decision a few years ago to try and develop deep relationships with fewer schools rather than being all over the city in a classroom here, a classroom there, really be kind of very prevalent in a school. And actually this year, for the first time, we have a philosopher in residence program in a local elementary school where we have someone who graduated from our program a couple of years ago, did her PhD at the University of Washington, who's working in a local elementary school and working with the teachers, working in the classrooms, and working with all of us who are also involved in that school. Our focus, almost all the schools in which we're involved are public schools that with populations of economically disadvantaged students. So the students who would be least likely to have access to these kinds of enrichment programs. And what we do generally is we kind of approach it in a number of different ways. So we teach a course at the University of Washington. I teach a course at the University of Washington, and I have some colleagues as well, each quarter about how to do philosophy in the schools. And then we send our undergraduates into the schools with mentors, graduate students, or some of the faculty who help them learn how to do this. And then they start to facilitate discussions with small groups of students usually, because these are often big classrooms, and they do it often in pairs. So we have the undergraduates in there. We have 3 graduate fellowships in philosophy for children. So we have 3 graduate students who are working as fellows and as part of that are involved in the Seattle schools. We do a workshop every summer for teachers, and then the teachers who are in that workshop then get continued mentoring. We send philosophers and other people into their classrooms and work with them throughout the year to help them to develop the ability to do this on their own if that's what they want to do. Sometimes they want us to continue to come, sometimes they want to take it on themselves. We also do a professional learning community, kind of a once a month, or sometimes it's every other week, depending on the school, with a group of teachers in a school. So we come in and facilitate philosophy sessions with the teachers as well. We also try and do various parent programs, so we'll invite parents into the classroom, we speak at PTAs, et cetera. So we try and kind of build a philosophical culture in a school. And I found that that's actually a really powerful way of making this happen, because what we're hoping will happen, and we're still sort of early in this process, we're probably in year 5 of this, what we're doing now, is that it will become so much a part of the school culture that we can then move on to another school and maybe keep our hand in that school but not be as engaged in the school. And so listening to what the other panelists have said and just thinking about this conversation we're having, I was thinking about, there was an article in the New York Times, which many of you probably saw on Thursday. It was another article about, you know, the death of the humanities and how people aren't taking humanities classes anymore in college, et cetera. And so it made me think 2 things. It made me think, one, so that it's even more important that philosophy and the humanities become a richer and more foundational part of public K-12 education. But 2, we're clearly not doing a very good job at getting the word out, right? At telling the story of why this is so important. And I had this conversation that was really troubling about a month ago. I was in the grocery store, and I ended up in this conversation with the guy who was checking the groceries, and because I don't know, he said something about being at the University of Washington, and I said, oh, I teach at the University of Washington. What do you teach? Philosophy. Oh, we had this whole conversation, and then he said to me, oh, I would love to take your class. And I said, well, great. He said, oh, no, my parents would disown me if I took a philosophy class. And it was really illuminating, right? And this article talks about this, that there are so many, and I remember this actually when I majored in philosophy as an undergraduate. My father was like, you're not majoring in philosophy. That's not, that's not a useful major. And I was fairly confident, and I just said, well, are you going to college or am I going to college? Like, and we had this debate about it, and it was not easy, right? It was something he really thought was impractical. It was fine to take a philosophy class, but majoring in it. And so how do we get the word across? How do we tell the story about, A, how important it is to be able to think clearly, to think critically, to communicate well, to learn how to write, to learn how to give reasoned arguments and to express yourself in a reasoned way in any job, and how do we communicate how important that is, not just for employment, but also for living a good life, right? How do we get that story across? I mean, many of us, if not all of us, are in this room because we all believe that, but there are obviously lots of people who have a very different view about what's important in education, and how do we tell the story better and more effectively than we have been able to do so far? So that's a question. I'm interested to hear what people think, what the other panelists think, as well as what all of you think.
I'd like to share with you what I think is one of the byproducts of a philosophical base in a school where teachers have that freedom to help children examine important questions, life-changing questions, and that byproduct is kindness. Most of our children enter school at age 3, and they are known as lifers. They go all the way through grade 12. It seems to be the entry point for most of our children, and again, most of our children come from the faculty of the University of Chicago. Several years ago, we had at the middle school some relational aggression issues, bullying. We're not perfect, but they were of great concern to many of us, and we had parents involved, students involved, and reflecting upon some of the relational aggression that was occurring, as well as some of the cyber bullying that, again, is so prevalent in many middle schools, if not earlier, across this country. And during that period of time, I kept reassuring parents as well as faculty that the laboratory schools were the kindest place I had ever been and had more community feeling of any place, even the best of public schools in which I participated. And it was just hard to imagine that this was just endemic to the laboratory schools, and there were things that could be done. And I still feel that way today, after we've dealt with some of the crises at that point. And in fact, last year, our schools went through a mission statement process, and part of that mission statement, the last 3 phrases in that statement is, we value experiential education, exhibiting kindness, and honoring diversity. And I would posit that much of that kindness and that honoring of diversity comes from the various types of tools that are engaged at a very young age, that allow our children to take different positions and to see different points of view, and to really honor that people are coming from different countries, different races, different religions, all of those diversity markers that are important to us. And we are fortunate that we get it naturally, because the University of Chicago, in its recruiting of faculty, wants to make sure that they have the best from the world, not just from this country, who are in front of our students at the university. And of course, those people from the world bring their children who want a education that we are able to provide here for them, right here in the south side of Chicago. So that's built in, but it's not just that we want children to be kind to each other. I believe that they are kind because they have better understanding of not only each other, but of themselves. And that comes, again, from that philosophical base that begins at age 3 and continues all the way through high school.
I want to build on that a little bit, and I agree wholeheartedly with that is a benefit of experiential education. I think there's some other really important benefits, and I want to draw out a couple of examples that I see in our own charter school. And one of them has to do with students, so sort of executive function in students, so ownership of their own learning and leadership in their own learning, that I think is also a result of this type of education. And I think we see that most clearly in our North Kenwood Oakland campus, which, if you're not familiar with our campuses or the neighborhood, it's at 47th and Greenwood, so not very far from here at all. And if you walk into a classroom, a kindergarten classroom during the literacy block in that school, what you would see is pretty astonishing to some visitors who walk in there for the first time. You'll see a teacher sitting at a table with a small group of students doing a guided reading lesson. And so really sitting there with a group of students who have been identified to have the same kind of level of skill on this trajectory of learning to read, and working quietly and intently with that small group. And that in and of itself, that the teacher's not standing at the front of the classroom talking to all the kids at the same time, is a huge paradigm shift relative to what's going on in most classrooms, especially in public schools that serve the kind of students that we serve. But if you layer on top of that, if you lift your eyes and you look at what's going on in the rest of the room, what you see is that there are small groups of students rotating through learning centers in that room, typically, without really much adult assistance at all. And if you go into any of those small group activities, you see that the students are actually conducting an activity with a set of goals, focused on that, working on it together in a group, and really doing that, being able to do that at age 4 or 5 on their own, to take charge of and take responsibility for their own learning. In the kind of schools with the kind of students that we work with, this is incredibly important because our kids have a very wide range of skills. That's true in all schools, but especially so with the types of students that we work with. But this whole idea that they have both the ownership and motivation and control of their own learning at such a young age, that they're able to collaborate with peers and work together at such a young age, and that then the teacher fundamentally changes the way she or he conducts classroom instruction and thinks about being a teacher, moving from this model of instilling knowledge into the students to this process of facilitating learning, where sometimes they're facilitating the learning, but sometimes students are facilitating their own learning or doing that in small groups of students. I would argue that that skill set fundamentally changes the way that these students think about themselves, about the value of education, and also about themselves as leaders that will translate and ripple through their lives in ways that it's almost impossible to calculate or predict the impact of that. So I do think that this goes far beyond what we're teaching students to a fundamental shift in this inquiry-based approach that changes schools, but it also changes the lives of people who experience that.
would love some audience participation. Are there questions? You can aim them towards one of us, any of us, whatever.
Well, I didn't think that Janna's question got answered. Maybe it's too hard a question. But actually, I think there is a huge misperception of what philosophy currently is, so that when parents react that philosophy is useless, or as my parents did when I wanted to major in it, it's in large part because they really have no experience. So if you taught it in high school, of course, that would be one way of changing that, or taught it in school, high school, whatever, that would be one way of changing it. But I think another is actually what I think of as evidence-sensitive, fact-based stuff, where you show how well philosophy majors do on all of the GREs, all that stuff, much better. And then you look at what kinds of jobs are not, the ones that are going to be available, but the desirable ones, where businesses prefer people who have broad intellectual visions and so on. They think coming out of business school is not always the best trade. It's always the best education for the top jobs. And I think there's a place where, if you like, they're just looking at the facts can be very sobering. So in my first big lecture to these 200 kids who've come to the University of North Carolina, that's the first thing that I do. On the handout for the lecture, websites that show them how to combat their parent skepticism, how to turn them into philosophers who can defend studying philosophy, not by giving airy-fairy speculative arguments, but actually the hard-nosed things that their parents claim to be the very test for what kind of education they should get.
Yeah, we did something like that in our department. We put together a little brochure for basically our undergraduates to give their parents that say, it's why study philosophy, and it has those kinds of facts, and then testimonials from, local doctors, business leaders, et cetera, in Seattle who studied philosophy and then went on to do whatever they're doing, and right.
One of the great things about working with children of university professors, particularly at a research university, is that their natural curiosity and ability to challenge anything comes very naturally at home, and really makes many of our parents very proud that their children are just like they are. And it's kind of fun. So we don't have that kind of problem.
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of things. The first is that part of my own personal experience gets in the way of me identifying with that, because my dad is a theologian, so I think he was praying that I would study philosophy when I came to the University of Chicago. And in some ways was, when I decided to study social sciences, I think was a little disappointed. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. But I do think that there's some also foundational base in the ways in which professions have changed. And if I look across our own institute, education used to be a field just for education, people who were trained in education. No longer the case. We have anthropologists, we have people who are philosophy majors, we have MBAs, and I think that this kind of cross-pollination across the disciplines, at least in the social sciences realm, has become much more common. And so I think there's also evidence to be found for the argument that you're making just in the changes of the way the professions work. It's a fundamentally different world than it was even 10 or 15 years ago in regards to this.
Who do you think affects young learners' interest in philosophy more, the parents or the teachers?
That's a really good question. In my experience, I find that the children, so I teach this year I'm teaching a second grade class, a third grade class, a fourth grade class, and a fifth grade class. And then as well, I'm doing some high school work. And the fourth and fifth graders, some of them their siblings have had philosophy. And they'll tell me that now, they're having these discussions at the dinner table, and that one student actually told me recently, oh, my mom's joined a philosophy group. She's going to do some philosophy. So I think it's not necessarily more or less. I think that the best case is where there's a kind of a joint effort, right? So what we do when we go into a classroom, we send home a letter to that all parents get, kind of explaining what the philosophy sessions are like and what we'll be doing, and we invite parents to come observe whenever they want. And we often, at the end of a term, we'll do a little philosophy cafe in which we bring like food and stuff to drink, and we talk about philosophy, and we invite parents to come too, and often they do. So I think if you can bring parents into this, it's really rich. It really enriches it. I think that a young person growing up with a parent who's talking about philosophical questions with them, but they don't get it in school, that's also great. I think there's something special about doing philosophy in school, because it's different to have a conversation with just your parent than having a conversation with a bunch of people your age. And that experience is particularly, I think, rich and interesting.
I'm not an educator formally trained, but I see the disconnect in philosophy is, from the parental point of view, that it is an esoteric study. What is missing is the connection between philosophizing and the decision-making process. And so we have a professor here at the University of Chicago, Martha Nussbaum, who is in the MBA program. And Harvard has a wonderful series called Justice, the Right Thing to Do. Those programs have a way of transferring the philosophical process into the decision-making process. Now it becomes observable by everyone of its benefit.
I think that's such an excellent point, and I think it touches on a couple of important things about philosophy and education. One is about the kind of usefulness, utility of it when it's translated into content, which is what you're talking about. So how do we actually draw this connection to the process of thinking and illuminate that? So help people to understand, students to understand, and parents to understand that this is fundamentally a way of thinking. It's a way of reasoning that has application across every discipline. That philosophy in that way is not an isolated, esoteric subject, but it's actually integrated into any intellectual pursuit in any discipline. And I think professors across all the disciplines at the University of Chicago, I know in my own coursework, I'm actively doing that by integrating that way of inquiry, that inquiry-based approach into my own content. And so I agree with you that in some ways we have to modernize our way of thinking and kind of bring to the fore this approach and process of thinking that philosophy entails, and making the connection between that and other subject matter more explicit, so that the understanding is that it's relevant. It's relevant to our day-to-day life. It's relevant to every subject you could possibly discuss or study. So I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Janna mentioned brochures that you would give to parents of undergraduate students, and you guys do cafes and things like that to get parents involved with the process. But how do you deal with particularly resilient parents, ones that are dogmatic and don't necessarily want their children to question in the first place, not at the undergraduate level, but at the K through 12 level?
Yeah, I think I've met a few of those parents, and fortunately, most of them were public school parents, and there was options that we provided when there were controversial subjects that sometimes we had to exclude their children. I'm not suggesting that's the best way to do it, but that's the way it's often done in public schools. It's easy to make some separation. But in an independent schools, there's some basic understandings that parents have. And part of those understandings is that they are going to get a wide variety of points of view, and that diversity of viewpoint is very important to the education of children. And whether it is a controversial book or a controversial piece of literature or discussions related to sex education or other kinds of things, whether war has any meaning or whatever they are discussing that is controversial, they understand that this is what happens at this school, and they don't take a pledge, but they basically understand that that is going to happen regardless of their own personal points of view. So I think it's a basic understanding at most independent schools, and if they don't like it, basically they leave.
We feel more pushes around instructional formats than we do around content. So the classroom that I described to you, the kindergarten classroom with the students in learning centers, is a very unusual and uncomfortable in some cases way of thinking about education for some parents, particularly because that is really countercultural in most public schools that serve the students that we work with. You just don't see that. And so those are the kind of pushes that we get, some around controversial material, but also around this kind of inquiry-based experiential approach to learning. Are they learning anything that way? Are they going to get the skills that they need in order to be able to pass that test in order to get to the place where they want to go? And we can't dismiss questions like that. They're really important. But it's also the case that we believe that we can get there along this path and have individuals who have mastered higher order thinking skills, have grappled with difficult content, and will be leaders as a result of participating in that. So we definitely have ongoing dialogue with parents about that all the time.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
We have lots of iPads and lots of technology in our schools, and there are certain moral and ethical questions that surround technology, and obviously those are discussions that take place not just in regular classrooms, but in terms of our computer science curriculum that begins in 2nd grade, and the ethical use of that. And obviously technology has ways of, I guess, gathering information that is not always accurate. And I think one of the great challenges of teachers today is helping students direct them to truth without, passing judgment on every piece of information that they are reading. And I think that it remains an enigma for many of us as to the proper way of utilizing technology. It still is a tool, but there are many aspects of that that I think schools are just beginning to grasp and to move forward with. So we don't have the answers on technology and necessarily philosophical thought, but I can tell you that at least moral thought, which is part of philosophy, is considered when talking about the ethics of the use of technology.
I have kind of two ways of thinking about your question relative to technology. One is that in our schools we've experimented with many of the things that you're talking about. So we had a one-to-one laptop program in both our high school and our middle school. And I think our big push in technology in the field of education as a whole is making sure that it doesn't become an add-on, a kind of a contribution to a lack of coherence in the school. And that's the way I see when I go around the school system. In many of the schools I see a lot of technology, but I don't see it being anchored to a larger sort of educational philosophy that makes it a useful tool. And so I guess I see technology as a tool in the same way curriculum is a tool, in the same way that calculators are a tool. And as long as we're using them in a way that connects to a coherent educational philosophy, they can be very powerful. But if they become a distraction or something that's taking away from kind of our focus day to day, then they can actually be something that's somewhat of a challenge or a distraction to what we're trying to accomplish. So I do think, though, that in terms of technology use, and this is the second point I would make, that our students have to become fluent in that way of thinking, because technology is everywhere. And so I think from that point of view, they have to get exposure regardless of how coherent or integrated it is into the educational program. So I think there are kind of two dimensions to that, but I agree with David that we have a long way to go to understanding how to make that the most useful tool. And I still think that as long as students are exposed and know how to use technology, they can still receive an excellent education without having technology be the only driving kind of tool in the toolkit.
Hi, I teach at a public high school in the suburbs where we do offer a philosophy high school class. We don't offer it every year, however, and I was wondering if we're at a very opportune time now with the Common Core state standards where we might actually be able to use those standards to our advantage in terms of critical thinking, analyzing multiple sources, and would this be a good opportunity for schools that are interested in pursuing high school philosophy classes as a way to sell to administration, school boards, parents, speaking to Professor Lone's earlier question, how to really try to incorporate this type of curriculum almost on the back of the Common Core state standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Philosophy Learning and Teaching organization, Plato, which has been mentioned a couple of times, this is an organization that was founded in the last few years that's trying to bring together people in the K through 12 philosophy fields all over the country. And one of the things we've been working on is ways to connect what we're doing to the Common Core standards, particularly I think it's speaking and listening. Am I getting that right? Anyway, there's a lot of language in the Common Core about collaborative conversations with diverse peers and et cetera, being able to follow an idea, to follow the ideas of your peers. And so I'm interested to hear what people think about this because I am sort of two minds about it. On the one hand, I see it as a potential opportunity to, as you say, convince administrators or whomever that this is a way that this is why philosophy is particularly important in a classroom. On the other hand, I fear that, what's going to happen with the Common Core if it's just the latest flavor of the month and it's going to fall apart, and do we want to be too tied to that because there's certainly that risk. We are, though, so Plato has a conference every other year, and our next conference is going to be in Seattle in June of 2015, and Jonathan Kozol is going to be the keynote, and so the focus of the conference is going to be inquiry and equity, and we're hoping one of the goals for the conference is to make it very much workshop format and to have a lot of the workshops be connecting to Common Core standards. So to have workshops about philosophy and the Common Core and ways in which to do this. And on a related note, I'm doing a webinar for the National Humanities Center, which has been doing these webinars for social studies and English teachers about ways to meet the Common Core standards in their teaching, and they've asked me to do the first philosophy one, which I'll be doing in March, that's sort of weaving into the Common Core. I'm doing a course about identity and community using books like The Bluest Eye and To Kill a Mockingbird, and so I think, the more we can utilize the language of the Common Core and make those kind of cases without tying ourselves too closely to it, I think that there's sort of a balance to be found there that is a little bit ephemeral.
I agree that I'm really of two minds on the Common Core on the question that you asked. I think it's a really important question, and there's so much uncertainty about where the Common Core will head. I think on the one hand, what the Common Core has in it is a much higher set of demands on the way that students think, which I think is really powerful and has a lot of potential in it. And I think philosophy can be connected directly to that, to say these courses actually address the demands of these higher order thinking skills and the kind of process behind thinking and teaching and learning, probably better than almost any subject you can think about. There's a huge alignment between what's written in the Common Core, the demand for intellectual inquiry in the Common Core, and what you're teaching in your philosophy course. I think my hesitation or my concern about the Common Core is that if it follows the pattern of, I think it's one of the unstated things about standards in our country is that this isn't the first time we've tried this. And so everybody's very enthusiastic about it, and I am too about the potential of it, but there was a big push for national standards in the 1980s, and then every single state has tried to do this in the 1990s. And I think if you look at the history of why those efforts never took root, one of them is the assessment piece of this, and where high stakes accountability systems focus, and where the kind of eggs are in those baskets of really what becomes a pretty narrow focus on math and English, or literacy and reading, which is understandable. I mean, nobody wants to touch standards in history in our country for obvious reasons, just that there's so much controversy around that. Even science is kind of borderline, right? Because across our country, there's some different thinking about what should go into those. And so I think the natural kind of narrowing of focus around what is assessed and what topics we're comfortable setting kind of national standards around, my fear is that it'll drive towards a narrowing rather than a widening, which may be bad for topics like philosophy. So I think that there's a lot that remains to be seen about how this is going to unfold nationally, but I do think you individually in your school system, in your school, can draw on the Common Core and drive hard to make sure that your school sees this and actions, that the actions are oriented in the right way.
I'm really glad you asked that question, because for most of the last year or so, I've been with colleagues who do nothing but criticize the Common Core. Much of how it actually came into being and how it was foisted upon so many schools across this country. But there's a lot of good stuff in there. And I like the approach of how do you, as an individual or as a school or a school district, make the best out of this and utilize this at a time that, we haven't been able to really think beyond just certain requirements for reading and mathematics. And, you ought to form a group of positive people saying, how can we make the best of the Common Core standards?
And I think because education is so local, that's where this is headed. This is going to be, as much as the whole idea behind it is for it to be implemented in a standard way across our country, it's much more likely, just because of the way our education system is set up, that it's going to translate in different ways in different places, from schools to districts to states. And so why not? In your school, this becomes a lever for something that's really powerful, and I think we'll see pockets of that. That's the kind of optimistic, glass half full interpretation of where we'll end up on this.
Now for questions, unfortunately. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.